Good day and welcome back to another DBZ Dokkan Battle video. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the concept of countering. So we're going to see what counters are and how they work. So these are counterattacks. I won't be covering the evasion and counterattacks of Super Saiyan 4 units, as I already covered this under evasion, as the principal point of these is that they don't take the attack, they evade and then counter, whereas we're specifically talking about units that will counterattack on every single normal attack that they receive, which is kind of a different mechanic in its own right. So how do counters work? Well, generally speaking, it's quite simple. The unit will be hit with a normal attack and then they will respond with a normal attack of their own. Now it's important to understand two things. One, anything to do with your passive will apply, your passive or your super attack will apply to your counters if the super attack occurs before the counter goes off. So for example, if your passive says that you build up 10% attack per normal attack performed, the unit will increase the damage of their counters, and counters will count towards those normal attack build up, much like you see here with Yardrak Goku. If a unit raises their attack and defense on their super attack for one turn, and they fire that super attack before firing their counters, that will also increase their attack and defense. If there is a medium chance of crit from their passive, that will also apply to their counters. The only things that won't apply to their counters are essentially anything to do with only super attack related things. The second super important thing to understand with counters is that counters essentially have their own modifier. So for example, you'll see that some of them counter with enormous power, some of them counter with tremendous power. So it's not a normal attack, it's its own separate attack with its own modifier. Now that we kind of understand the basics of countering, there is some other important things to understand. The first thing is that counters cannot trigger an additional attack. So when a unit counters a normal attack, they cannot trigger an additional and they cannot trigger a additional super. However, crit from their passive will still apply. If a unit evades an attack, they will not trigger a counter because they have not received damage. Counters can only occur when the unit takes a point of damage. That is why you will always get some kind of point of damage, whether it's 56 damage or whatever it is. But no matter what, a unit will have to receive damage before they can fire off a counter. The only hidden potential system that will apply to that counter is crits. Everything else from passives, like I mentioned before, will still apply. The final super important thing to understand about counters is that generally speaking, units that counter have damage reduction from normals. This is because it enables them to activate their counters, and the counters are a very large portion of their offense. Counters are a very big offensive tool for these kind of units, and the best build traditionally for counter based units is crit. The reason being is because the modifier on counters is so low. Without them having crit, they won't be able to bypass defense in hard events to actually cause damage. So generally speaking, crit is the best build to go for. If a unit has crit in their passive, then obviously you can apply additionals if you want to, but generally speaking, crit is the best build for counter based units. So now that we've kind of covered the basics of counters, we're going to look at a couple of examples to better understand how counters work and how the mechanism works in its entirety. So we have here, for example, Strength Vegeta. So Strength Vegeta will gain only defense on hit, and he raises his attack for one turn on his super attack. So it's important to understand two things. One, we will see the difference his super attack has on his counter damage. And two, we know that his counter crit comes entirely from his hidden potential system. As I mentioned before, he cannot trigger additionals on counters. However, should he raise his attack twice, we will raise that level of counter damage. So you can see right off the bat, 200k off of this counter is not necessarily the craziest amount. Vegeta is now going to super twice, and because of this, his counterattack damage is going to raise. This is because the greatly raising attack from his super attack effect does apply to his counters. You can see immediately that damage has jumped up quite substantially. However, you'll notice that the damage between the two counters does not change, and that is because counters do not count as super attacks, and thus he cannot greatly raise attack and defense off of his counters, because he only raises attack and defense off of his super. Another great example of this is Super Saiyan God SS Vegito. We're going to get a good look at him applying a very similar mechanic. Vegito will do a counter before he supers. We'll then be able to see how much damage he does afterwards. It's also super important to understand that counters do not contribute to his raising of attack and defense. So for example, you will see that the damage he does beforehand does not change. His counters will not increase from counter to counter, as his only raising mechanism is his super attack. So you'll see there 242k into 242k. You'll also notice the importance of crits here. You'll notice how the first counter did no damage pretty much, whereas the second and third counter did quite substantial damage. This is why crit is so important in regards to counter units and their various levels of performance. So it's just something important to note. It's always good to understand how your units are working and how everything's functioning around them, so you can better understand their functionality and use their counters very well. One good thing about counter units is, generally speaking, they're pretty reliable in regards to tanking normals in a lot of events. However, they can be fallible to super attacks. That's why a lot of them come with foresight or other mechanisms to kind of circumvent this. We're going to use Super Vegito as another example of the raising mechanic. Vegito's passive does not raise his attack, however he has medium chance to crit. This medium chance to crit will apply to his counters as well as his super attack. So this gives him a pretty good base of critting before even factoring in the hidden potential system. Remember, the hidden potential system proc is different to the passive proc, but it's always good to know. It's also interesting to see that he still takes quite a substantial amount of damage because of the fact that he does not have damage reduction capabilities, so his damage that he takes does not really change. He gains a little bit of defense off of his super, which is going to help him, but you can see here the change in his attack damage, again based entirely off of his super attack. Finally, the last example we're going to take a look at is Yardrat Goku. Now Yardrat Goku is a different example entirely. Yardrat Goku raises his attack and defense and also his crit chance based off how many attacks he does. So now this applies from his counters as well. So you're going to see Yardrat Goku fire off a super attack, fire off an additional, he will then counter, and then when he counters again, you're actually going to see that attack rise up, and that's because his counters will count as attacks, which will trigger the increase from his passive. So although counters don't count as super attacks, they do count as normal attacks, which will help with increasing his overall damage and performance. So after this, I'm basically going to wrap it up, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you now better understand the premise of counter-attacking units. They are a little bit finicky, and yes, there's instances where they won't look so great, but generally speaking, they're pretty fun units to use, and when you get it right, they can do some pretty big damage. They're units that when they set in their element, they can really pump out some good damage whilst also being very defensively sound. So it's always interesting to see how well they do. So here we're just going to take a look at Goku, and I just want to note the difference, and it's due to his counterattack. So here you're going to see he does 368, and then when he gets hit again, he'll do 399, and this is because his counters count as normal attacks. So hopefully this explained everything you need to know. If you guys are unclear about anything, please let me know, but otherwise I'll see you next time. Till then, bye.